Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
Christmas morning has a certain smell, something between cinnamon and coffee, and that unmistakable scent of forced family unity. And for some reason, I always catch it before I even open my eyes. This year was no different. I woke up to the low hum of Christmas music playing from the living room stereo, the faint clinking of dishes being laid out, and my mother's sing-song voice calling down the hall like we were still kids. Waking up to stockings and Santa. Except we weren't kids anymore. I'm 45 and my sister Maggie is 42, though if you heard my mother speak of her, you'd think Maggie was still 12 and winning her first baton-twirling trophy. I didn't rush out of bed like I used to as a kid. I took my time, because when you know you're walking into a room where you'll be outnumbered, where smiles are as loaded as a shotgun and every word is sharpened like a knife, you don't exactly hurry in. I brushed my hair, put on some lip balm, and stared at my reflection just long enough to remind myself not to react. That was the key to surviving a Christmas in this house. Don't react. No matter what they say. No matter how hard they try to twist the knife. When I walked into the living room, the tree was lit like something out of a catalog, overly decorated with ornaments that didn't match and tinsel hanging like it was thrown by a drunk elf. The stockings were still up, the same ones we'd had since we were kids. Mine was the red one with the crooked L that had started to peel off back in the early 90s. Maggie's was a perfectly white, untouched piece of craft store perfection, as if my mother had sewn it just last year, even though it had supposedly been handmade when she was born. Sure. Maggie was already on the couch, robe cinched tight, legs crossed like she owned the place, which, as it turned out, was exactly the point of today's big announcement. My mother had made coffee and was plating some awful store-bought cinnamon rolls she tried to pass off as homemade. Dad was in his usual corner chair, newspaper folded in his lap, trying to pretend he wasn't there. He never really said much, always the quiet one, the peacemaker, or at least that's how Mom liked to frame it. To me, he was just complicit with silence. "Look who finally woke up," my mom chirped, as if she hadn't already complained to Maggie that I was never an early riser 30 minutes prior. I smiled, said good morning, and made myself a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. Then I sat down, careful not to let my eyes linger too long on any of them. That's when she said it. "Well, we figured now's as good a time as any," Mom started, brushing invisible crumbs from her pants, before placing both hands on her knees like she was about to deliver a State of the Union address. "Your father and I have decided. We're giving the house to Maggie. It just makes sense, after everything she's done for us." That was it. No build-up, no soft landing, just a surgical strike to the heart. Maggie smiled, all sweet and fake, the way she used to when she'd break my toys and then cry so I'd get in trouble. She didn't even look at me, didn't have to. She knew she'd won before the war even started. My dad looked down, suddenly interested in his newspaper again, but I saw his hand grip the armrest just slightly. He wasn't surprised, maybe guilty, maybe just tired, but definitely not surprised. My heart was pounding, but I didn't let it show. Not a twitch, not a flinch. Just sipped my coffee and nodded like someone who had just been told the weather was partly cloudy. Inside, though, I felt the burn. Years of being the responsible one, the one who left home, worked 2 jobs through college, paid off her own student loans, and never once asked for help. Years of being the afterthought while Maggie moved back in after her 3rd divorce and never paid rent, never bought groceries, never lifted a damn finger except to scroll on her phone. And now she deserved the house? My mother kept talking, droning on about how Maggie's been here, taking care of us, sacrificing so much, like I was some ghost relative who only showed up for major holidays. They always acted like her moving back in was some noble act of service instead of a cushy fallback from yet another self-inflicted disaster. I felt my jaw clench, so I leaned back on the couch and looked around the room. The picture frames, the dusty old piano no one played anymore, the scratch on the wall I got blamed for when I was 10, even though it was Maggie and her stupid rollerblades. All of it felt like part of a stage set, a carefully constructed illusion they all agreed to keep pretending was real. "I'm so happy for her," I said finally, with a smile so wide it hurt. "She really deserves it." My mom beamed. Maggie still wouldn't look at me. My dad blinked slowly, like maybe he knew this wasn't over, but they had no idea. They didn't know what I knew, what I'd found out, what I had planned. And Christmas morning was about to turn into something none of them would forget. Let me ask you something. Have you ever sat at a table with people who say they love you and realize they don't actually know a damn thing about you? Or worse, they do, and they just don't care, because that's what this was. And I wasn't about to leave without saying something, but not out loud, not yet. There are moments in life that shape you long before you understand you're being shaped. Small, seemingly insignificant events that slowly carve out the landscape of your personality, like a river cuts through rock, unnoticed at first, but irreversible in the long run. And in my case, most of those moments involved my sister Maggie, my mother's unwavering smile, and my father's all too familiar silence. I used to think I was the problem. When you grow up being told just let it go every time your sibling lies about something and gets away with it, or don't make a fuss when your belongings mysteriously disappear from your room, only to show up in hers a week later with some half-baked explanation, you eventually begin to believe that being quiet, being agreeable, being invisible is the only way to earn peace, if not love. But peace doesn't come from swallowing your words until they turn bitter inside your stomach. It comes from truth. And the truth is, Maggie wasn't some misunderstood angel. She was clever, manipulative, and always 2 steps ahead of consequences. Not because she was smarter than me, but because she had the advantage of immunity, granted to her by a mother who saw her as a fragile flower in need of constant sheltering, and a father who had long since given up on challenging anything that disrupted the fragile harmony of our household. I remember one Christmas when we were around 10 and 12. Maggie wanted a bike, a pink one with white streamers and a basket. My parents couldn't afford both the bike and the camera I had been asking for all year, so they compromised and got the bike. But to keep things fair, they added a little tag on the handlebars that said, "To Lena and Maggie." She never let me touch it, not once. I watched her ride it up and down the street while I sat on the porch steps with a smile so fake it made my face ache. And when I mentioned it later, how it was supposed to be ours, my mom said, "Well, Maggie just really loves that bike. Let her enjoy it. You don't even like pink, do you?" It was always like that. The justification, the minimizing, the subtle twisting of logic that made me question my own memory, my own feelings. It was like living in a house where the rules only applied to one child and the other was the exception to every single one. In college, I worked nights at a diner and studied during the day. My parents never came to visit. Not once. When I graduated, they mailed a card with a $20 bill and a note that said, "We're so proud of you. Love, Mom and Dad." Maggie, meanwhile, dropped out of community college after 2 semesters, got pregnant at 22, and moved back home without even pretending she had a plan. And my mother acted like she had just come home from war. "She's been through so much," she'd say, brushing Maggie's hair like she was a little girl again. "We just need to be here for her right now." The "we" always included me. The responsibility, the silent expectation that I'd help, pitch in, pay when needed. And I did. When my dad had his heart scare 8 years ago and they thought he might need surgery, I transferred over $15,000 from my savings to cover the deductible. I did it without hesitation, without even asking for acknowledgement. They never paid me back. They never even mentioned it again. But later that year, I got a Christmas card that said, "It means the world to us to have Maggie home again." No mention of the money, no mention of the sacrifice. Over the years, I learned to detach. I built a life elsewhere, a job I loved, friends who felt more like family, a modest condo I bought myself. I never talked about my family unless someone asked. And even then, I kept it vague. "We're not that close," I'd say with a tight smile. And people would nod like they understood, like they didn't want to dig too deep. Most didn't. But there was always a tether, thin, fraying, but unbroken. Because despite everything, I still showed up. Holidays, birthdays, a few long weekends. I told myself it was out of duty, but the truth is, part of me kept hoping they'd see me. Really see me. Not the one who never needed help, not the one who never caused trouble, but the one who had always been there, quietly holding everything together while they focused on Maggie's latest crisis. That hope finally died the week before Christmas, when I got a call from their neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, who used to mow their lawn for a few bucks when I was a kid, and now did it just to help out. He asked if I was coming by for the holidays, said he had some questions about the deed situation, which instantly made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He hesitated, then said, "Well, I overheard Diane mention they added Maggie to the house deed a few months back. Figured you knew." I didn't. And when I called my mother to ask about it, her tone changed like a switch being flipped. "It's not something we need to discuss over the phone," she said, like I was a stranger asking about their medical records, instead of their daughter who had helped save their damn house from foreclosure years ago. I hung up and sat in my car for 10 minutes, just breathing. Then I opened my laptop, logged into a few databases I knew how to navigate, and pulled the public property records for their address. There it was, clear as day. Margaret Lane Harper, added as co-owner on July 3rd. They didn't just make a decision, they made a choice. A deliberate, silent choice to exclude me, to gift the very roof I helped secure to the one person who had never contributed a dime and still lived rent-free like it was some sort of reward for breathing. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not like a twig, but like a rusted lock finally breaking open after years of being sealed shut. And inside that lock wasn't just anger. It was clarity, cold, calculated clarity. I wasn't going to fight them. I wasn't going to yell or cry or beg them to treat me differently. I was done with that version of myself. I was going to make them see the cost. Not in dollars, but in truth. And on Christmas morning, they'd unwrap it like a gift they didn't even know they were receiving. When I tell people I'm not a confrontational person, they tend to believe me, mostly because I've spent a lifetime mastering the art of silence, the kind that isn't born from weakness, but rather from a precise and painful calculation that it's better to be underestimated than to waste your breath trying to convince people of something they've already decided not to see. I've never raised my voice at my family, never stormed out of a room or slammed a door, never laid down ultimatums or drawn lines in the sand, because I learned early on that in our house, emotions were ammunition, and the person who exploded first usually lost, no matter how justified they were. But staying quiet doesn't mean staying still. And as I sat in my kitchen 2 nights before Christmas, surrounded by stacks of old email printouts, bank statements, and notarized letters I had quietly compiled over the past few months, I realized just how long I'd been preparing for this moment without even fully knowing it. It had started with a hunch, the kind of nagging suspicion you don't want to believe at first, the kind that feels paranoid until it isn't. After that call from Mr. Jenkins, I didn't sleep for 2 nights, not because I was shocked, but because I was furious with myself for being surprised at all. I should have known. Of course they gave Maggie the house. Of course they didn't tell me. Why would they? I was the one who handled my own life, paid my own way, and never asked for anything. They knew I wouldn't make a scene. They counted on it. And for a while, they were right. But I couldn't let this slide, not just because of the money, though let's be honest, 15 grand isn't pocket change, but because of what it represented. This wasn't about a house. It was about history, about being erased from it. So I dug, quietly. I started with the property records and traced the new deed back to a family lawyer my parents had used for years. A guy named Robert Fisk, who used to hand out mini candy canes at church every December and had a reputation for keeping things in the family. I called his office pretending to be a prospective client and asked about general procedures for deed modifications involving multiple family members. The receptionist, bless her overworked soul, rattled off more than she probably should have and confirmed that yes, in July, a Diane Harper had come in to make adjustments to the ownership documents of her property, adding one Margaret Harper as a joint tenant with rights of survivorship. That meant when they died, Maggie would inherit the house automatically, no will needed, no probate, no room for questions. Except now there were questions, a lot of them, like whether my father had ever signed off on this, because when I asked him casually on the phone if they'd done any estate planning lately, he mumbled something vague about still thinking it through. Either he was lying, which was unlike him, or, and this seemed more likely, he genuinely didn't know. That was the first crack. The second came when I went back through my bank records and found the wire transfers I'd made to my parents during Dad's hospital stay. 3 payments, $5,000 each, clearly marked. And one email from my mother, dated April 3rd, thanking me for helping us cover the deductible and medical stuff. It wasn't ironclad proof of a loan, but it sure as hell wasn't a gift either. I forwarded the documents to my friend Casey, a family attorney in Atlanta who owed me a favor from years ago, when I helped her get out of a miserable temp job. She read through everything and called me back the next morning. "This isn't slam dunk fraud," she said, "but it smells bad. If your dad didn't consent to that deed change and the house was jointly owned, there might be grounds to contest. And the money, you've got leverage. At the very least, you could force them into mediation." I didn't want mediation. I wanted exposure. I wanted them to see that the daughter they'd ignored wasn't going to vanish quietly this time. Casey drafted a formal notice, part legal threat, part personal reckoning, and I printed it on thick textured paper that felt more like a wedding invitation than a warning shot. I folded it carefully, slid it into an envelope with no return address, and placed it in the front pocket of my coat, where it stayed for 2 full days, untouched. Like a live grenade I was waiting to throw. I could have mailed it, I could have emailed it, or even dropped it in their mailbox anonymously. But that wouldn't have had the same impact. Because this wasn't about getting the house back or dragging my family to court. This was about showing them that I thought I saw everything now, that I had finally stopped looking the other way. And more importantly, that I knew how to speak their language. Quiet, formal, polite on the surface, but with the kind of weight that makes people sit up straight and stop chewing their Christmas ham. The night before Christmas, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, holding the envelope in one hand, my other gripping the edge of the dresser like I needed the stability. I thought about what I was doing, what it would mean, how it would change things, maybe permanently. There was still time to walk it back, to let it go, to shrug, smile, and play the part I'd been assigned for over 40 years. But I didn't. Because something had shifted in me. Something had cracked wide open. I was tired of being polite, tired of being silent, tired of pretending that love was unconditional when in this house it had always come with strings, and mine had been pulled too tightly for far too long. So I folded the coat, slipped the envelope into the inner lining for extra measure, and went to sleep that night knowing exactly what I was going to do in the morning. It wasn't revenge, not really. Not the kind with shouting or slammed doors, but it was a kind of justice, the kind delivered with the quiet grace of a scalpel, not a hammer. And when the time came, I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't accuse, I wouldn't even raise my voice. I would just hand it to him, and let the silence speak for itself. There's something uniquely artificial about the cheer of Christmas morning in certain households, a kind of curated joy that doesn't quite reach the eyes, where everyone knows their lines and hits their cues like actors in a low-budget family sitcom, the tree standing proudly in the corner like a third parent, the lights twinkling with forced optimism, the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls pretending to cover up the tension that simmers just beneath the surface of carefully wrapped gifts and overly enthusiastic greetings. In our house, that performance had been perfected over decades, polished to the point where even the uncomfortable silences had a script. And the fake smiles were worn like well-fitted masks. I knew that script by heart, had played my role with practiced indifference, but this year I was holding the last page, the one no one else had seen, the one that would rewrite the ending. I arrived just after 9, deliberately late enough to stir irritation in my mother without being accused of disrespect, because if there's one thing Diane Harper couldn't tolerate, It was anything that disrupted her sense of order, especially on Christmas. She opened the door with her trademark tight-lipped smile, that particular expression she wore when she was trying very hard to pretend everything was under control, and waved me in like I was a guest she didn't particularly want to entertain. The living room was as over-decorated as ever, the fireplace cluttered with garland, scented candles burning too strong, and stockings still hanging as if anyone over the age of 15 gave a damn about them anymore. Maggie was already on the couch, lounging in new silk pajamas, barefoot, and sipping a mimosa like a bored heiress waiting for her inheritance to clear. The coffee table was littered with gifts, most of them already opened, tissue paper spilling out like guts from a carcass. And as I walked in, Maggie offered a lazy smile that didn't touch her eyes, a smirk really, like she'd already won and now could afford to be magnanimous. My father was in his usual armchair, his expression unreadable, a man perpetually trying not to take sides in a war he refused to acknowledge, even as it scorched the ground around him. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," my mother said, with that syrupy voice she reserved for guests and people she needed something from. "We saved a few presents for when you got here. Maggie wanted to open hers early. She just couldn't wait." I nodded, took off my coat slowly, and hung it by the door, feeling the weight of the envelope inside the inner pocket like a heartbeat. I didn't bother commenting on the presents or the early unwrapping or the mimosa in my sister's hand. I just walked over to the kitchen, poured myself some coffee that had clearly been reheated at least once, and returned to the living room with the kind of quiet composure that always made my mother uneasy, because she couldn't decide whether it was passive aggression or something worse. We went through the motions. I opened a few gifts, a scarf I didn't need, a cookbook I'd never use, and a scented candle that smelled suspiciously like last year's regift, and pretended to be grateful while my mother watched me with the expression of someone expecting applause. Maggie got a new tablet, a gift card to some spa she already frequented, and a small velvet box that I didn't look at long enough to identify but knew wasn't cheap. After the last gift was opened, there was a moment, just a beat, of quiet, and then my mother clapped her hands together as if signaling the next scene. "We've got one more surprise," she said, eyes sparkling with forced excitement. "Your father and I talked about it, and we've decided it's time to make things official. Maggie's going to take over the house. It just makes sense, after everything she's done for us." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was the kind that seeps into your bones, cold and hollow, because it confirms something you already knew but hoped, irrationally, might not be true. Maggie didn't react much. She just smiled, modest and smug at the same time, while my father looked down at the floor, his hands gripping the sides of his chair as if bracing for impact. I took another sip of coffee, let the silence stretch, then leaned over, pulled the envelope from my coat pocket, and turned to my father. "I brought you something too," I said, my voice even and calm. "Thought it was time we had a little clarity." He took the envelope without looking at me, his fingers slow and cautious, and I watched as he unfolded the paper inside, his eyes scanning the text, his face changing gradually, first confusion, then realization, then something close to shock. My mother leaned over to see what it was, but he held it close, unwilling or maybe unable to share just yet. "What is it?" she asked sharply, her smile slipping. "Frank, what is that?" He didn't answer. He just kept reading, slowly, like the words were rearranging everything he thought he knew. When he finally looked up at me, his face was pale, mouth slightly open, and for the first time in a very long time, I saw something behind his eyes that looked like recognition. "What did you do?" my mother demanded, her voice rising. "I gave him the facts," I said simply. "I documented the money I gave you for the house, the bank records, the emails. I also noted that Maggie was added to the deed without both owners' consent, which may or may not be legally binding. I thought he deserved to know." My mother stood up, red creeping into her cheeks. "How dare you bring this up on Christmas morning? How dare you call it a surprise?" I shot back, the calm in my voice now laced with something sharper. You gave away the house like it was a toy from under the tree. You erased me like I was never here. Maggie looked like she wanted to say something, but for once she kept her mouth shut. My father was still holding the paper, still staring at it like it held a secret he'd never imagined. I didn't come here to fight, I continued. I just wanted the truth to have a seat at the table, for once. And then I stood, gathered my coat, and walked toward the door. Leaving the paper in my father's hands, my mother fuming silently, and my sister finally out of things to say. That morning, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't even wait for their reaction, because I'd already said everything I needed to, and now all that was left was for them to live with it. There is a strange quiet that follows truth when it's finally spoken aloud. A heavy, unsettling silence that doesn't bring relief or closure, but rather a deep and echoing reverberation through every memory, every assumption, every dynamic that once seemed so fixed and familiar. I didn't expect yelling, not really. I knew my mother would try to regain control, that Maggie would retreat into whatever victim role she could invent to survive the storm, and that my father, as he always had, would sit still with a look on his face that didn't quite qualify as confusion, but wasn't entirely comprehension either. The kind of expression that said, I know things have gone too far, but I don't know how to stop them now. What I didn't anticipate was just how swiftly the atmosphere would shift from performative holiday warmth to something brittle and unspoken, as if the air itself had been laced with blame and realization, and none of them could figure out how to breathe through it. After I left the living room that morning, coat in hand, boots squeaking slightly on the entryway tile, still wet from melted snow, I paused at the door, not to wait for anyone to follow, because I knew they wouldn't, but to listen. I heard nothing at first. No movement, no protest, just the whispering flicker of the gas fireplace and the distant sound of some forgotten Christmas carol continuing on the stereo as if it hadn't just witnessed the implosion of a carefully orchestrated family delusion. Then finally, a single voice, my father's, low and hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a while. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. The question wasn't meant for me. I knew that. It was directed toward my mother, and the fact that he asked it at all told me that my suspicions had been right. He hadn't known. He hadn't signed anything. He hadn't even been consulted, which, depending on how the legal side shook out, could mean more than just a broken promise. It could mean a reversal, a reckoning. And for someone like my mother, who had spent her entire life manipulating situations from the shadows, the exposure was a wound more devastating than any legal consequence could ever be. I stood in the hallway for a moment longer, long enough to hear my mother's clipped and defensive tone launch into her familiar rhythm. How she was just trying to keep things simple, how Maggie had been through so much, how she thought I didn't care about the house, as if ignoring me for years had been a mutual decision we'd all agreed to. I didn't need to hear more. I stepped outside, let the cold hit my face, and for the first time in what felt like decades, I breathed air that didn't belong to them. Over the next few days, I didn't answer their calls, not right away. My mother left exactly one voicemail, tight-lipped and formal, instructing me to call when you're ready to talk like an adult, which was rich coming from a woman who'd orchestrated legal maneuvers behind her husband's back and pretended it was an act of love. Maggie didn't call at all, typical, and my father, well, he finally did. 3 days after Christmas, I saw his name flash on my screen while I sat in my kitchen sipping lukewarm tea, and something in me softened enough to pick up. His voice was tired, not just physically but spiritually, like someone who had finally seen the full cost of decades spent avoiding conflict in the name of keeping peace. He didn't ask questions, didn't defend anyone. He just said, I read it all. I talked to a lawyer. We need to fix this. I want to fix this. There was a pause between us, the kind that could hold the weight of years, and then I said something I hadn't planned to say. You can come stay with me for a while, just until you figure it out. And just like that, the tide shifted. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet movement of someone choosing, finally, to realign his loyalty. Not with the loudest voice in the room, but with the one that had waited in the corner, unnoticed and unappreciated, for far too long. By the end of January, he had packed a few bags, said goodbye to a house that no longer felt like home, and moved into my spare bedroom. He didn't bring much, some clothes, a stack of books, an old shaving kit, but what he brought with him was heavier. Regret, confusion, the slow unraveling of denial. We didn't talk about it every day. Some days we just sat in silence, watching TV or reading or making coffee. But on the nights when he couldn't sleep, he'd sit at the kitchen table and tell me things about Maggie's first lie, about how my mother had always insisted on managing the truth, about the time he almost left and then didn't, because it was easier to stay and pretend. I should have said something, he'd whisper. All those years, I should have said something. I didn't comfort him. I didn't rush to absolve. I just nodded. Because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is let someone sit with the truth they helped build. As for the house, well, it's complicated. The paperwork is under review. The lawyer says the deed transfer might not hold if it's proven my father never consented. The bank documents I supplied strengthen the case. It'll take months to sort through. My mother has gone quiet on the matter, at least with me, though she's tried to play martyr with other relatives, spinning some narrative about how I've attacked the family and threatened to sue. She leaves out the part where I paid for that roof, where I bailed them out when the bills came crashing down, and where I stood by while she erased my name from the story. Maggie, she's still there, still living in that house, but for the first time in her life, she's not protected, not blindly, not without consequence. She called once, left a message saying we shouldn't let money tear the family apart, a laughable statement from someone who's never paid her own way, but I never called back. Because it's not about money, it never was. It's about visibility. It's about truth. It's about being done with the silence. And still, there's one thing I've never told them. One small, lingering detail that no one asked about. My father's new power of attorney, quietly signed, properly witnessed, and legally binding, names me. Not Maggie, not Diane, just me. Maybe I'll never need it. Maybe nothing else will come of it. Or maybe one day, when everything finally catches up to the people who thought they could control the narrative forever, that single document will be the final shift in a story long overdue for revision. Some would say I went too far, that I should have just walked away, let them rot in their illusions, and built a new life without them. Others might think I didn't go far enough, that I should have burned the bridge entirely and danced in the ashes. But the truth is, I didn't do this to destroy anything. I did it so I could finally stop pretending. And maybe that's the most radical thing you can do in a family like mine. Stop pretending. Speak plainly. Let the silence end. Let them hear the cost of everything they chose not to see. Even now, I don't know if I won. I don't know if there are winners in stories like these. But I know this. For the first time in my life, I didn't disappear. And that, in the end, was enough.